The text message came through at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening, while I was still in uniform, still smelling faintly of the West Wing's recycled air, and it read exactly like this: "Don't come to your sister's engagement party. The guest list is already full." No apology, no explanation, no, "I'm sorry, honey." Just 2 sentences from the man who raised me, discarding me like a seating chart error. I read it 3 times before I understood he meant it. And somewhere underneath the White House, past 2 Secret Service checkpoints that knew my name, past the badge that said Colonel Griffin, I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. "My name is Savannah Griffin. I'm 46 years old and I hold the rank of Colonel in the United States Army. For the last 3 years I've served in a classified advisory capacity at the White House, working alongside the National Security Council on matters I'm not permitted to discuss with anyone, including my own family, especially my own family. To them I was never anything more than the daughter who works for the government. Not a doctor, not a lawyer, not anyone with a title worth repeating at Thanksgiving. Just a woman in her mid-40s who never married, never had children, and somehow never amounted to what my father considered success. Success in my father's mind had a name: Lauren. My younger sister sells luxury real estate in Charlotte, and 6 months ago she got engaged to a man named Bradford Ashworth, the third, whose family owns half the commercial property on the east side of the city. When she called to tell my parents, I heard the celebration through the phone from 3 states away, my mother's laughter, ice clinking in glasses, my father's booming voice saying, "Now that's what I call marrying well." I sat in my government apartment that night alone and felt happy for her. I did. Lauren has always had a warmth to her that draws people in, and I never begrudged her that. What I begrudged, if I'm honest with myself now, was the silence that followed whenever anyone asked about me. The engagement party was supposed to be at the Ashworth family's estate outside the city, the kind of event with a string quartet and a guest list curated like a museum exhibit. I'd already requested the leave. I'd already bought a dress, pale blue, modest, nothing that would draw attention away from my sister, because that has always been the rule in my family, spoken or not. Don't outshine Lauren. Don't make this about you. I never minded following that rule. What I minded was discovering in a 2-line text message that I wasn't even welcome to stand quietly in the back. I sat in my car in the White House parking structure for a long time after that message arrived, engine off hands, still on the wheel like I was waiting for permission to drive somewhere. I thought about calling my father. I thought about asking him what I'd done, whether there was some version of this story where I'd embarrassed him, some fight I couldn't remember starting. But I already knew there wasn't. There didn't need to be. My father had never needed a reason to make me feel like a guest in my own family. He'd been doing it for 20 years in smaller ways, quieter ways, the graduation ceremonies he skipped, the promotions. He never asked about the birthdays that slipped his mind, while Lauren's were marked on the calendar in red ink. This was just the loudest version of something I'd learned to live with a long time ago. So I typed back one word: understood. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears at a moment like this, and I didn't have any to give. What I had instead was a strange, settling calm, the kind that comes after you've absorbed a blow you were half expecting your whole life. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the car, and drove back through the gates I'd just left 20 minutes earlier. The guard at the checkpoint, a young corporal named Diaz, glanced at my face and said, "Everything all right, ma'am?" And I told him yes, because what else was there to say? I had a briefing in the morning. I had a country's worth of problems waiting for me upstairs that had nothing to do with seating charts or guest lists or a father who couldn't be bothered to make room for me at his own daughter's celebration. I went back to my office. I sat at my desk under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by files I couldn't take home, even if I wanted somewhere to take them, and I told myself the same thing I'd told myself after every slight, every skipped ceremony, every birthday that came and went unmarked. This is fine. This is who they are. This is not going to be the thing that breaks you. I believed that sitting there that night. I was wrong. The call came the next evening just after 7 while I was still finishing paperwork nobody outside a small circle would ever see. My phone buzzed against the desk, and Lauren's name lit up the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Some tired, guarded part of me assumed she was calling to smooth things over on Dad's behalf the way she sometimes did, playing peacemaker between two people who'd never really fought so much as quietly drifted into separate corners of the same family. I answered anyway. "How could you do this to us?" Her voice cracked on the last word, not angry, wrecked. I sat up straight, confused in a way that felt almost physical, like the floor had shifted under my chair. "Do what, Lauren? I haven't done anything. I told Dad I understood. I'm not coming. That's it. Don't." Her breath hitched through the phone. "Don't act like you don't know what's happening right now." I genuinely didn't. I told her so, and something in my tone must have convinced her, because she stopped accusing long enough to explain. A national magazine, one of those glossy political weeklies that covers Washington the way other magazines cover Hollywood, had run a feature on a recent ceremony at the White House honoring military advisors who'd contributed to a classified operation the previous year. There was a photograph. Not a candid, not anything I'd posed for with intention, just a group shot from an official event, the kind taken because protocol requires it filed away and forgotten by everyone in the frame, except apparently whoever laid out that week's issue. Underneath it, in small print, my name. Colonel Savannah Griffin, Senior Military Advisor to the National Security Council. My father had been sitting in his recliner with that magazine open on his lap, Lauren said, flipping through it the way he flips through everything, half-attention television murmuring in the background. And then he'd stopped, gone still, read it again. My mother thought it was a misprint at first, a clerical error, two names accidentally crossed. But my father knew my face. He'd looked at that photograph for a long time, Lauren told me, and then he'd gotten up without a word and gone into the other room and started making phone calls. He called people from his old Rotary Club who'd served. He called a neighbor whose son was in the Marines. He was trying, she said, to find someone who could tell him whether this was real, whether the title meant what it seemed to mean, because it didn't match anything he thought he knew about his own daughter's life. Nobody could tell him much. Senior advisor roles like mine don't come with easy explanations, and the people he was calling weren't exactly plugged into White House staffing. So he sat there that night, according to Lauren, staring at a magazine, increasingly rattled by a version of me he'd never once asked to meet. "He thinks you did this on purpose," Lauren said. I actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Did what on purpose? I didn't submit that photo. I didn't write that caption. I don't even control what gets published about ceremonies I attend, Lauren. That's not how any of this works. He thinks you planned it. To embarrass him. Right before my engagement party." Her voice dropped, and I could hear her pacing the particular rhythm of someone walking a hallway they've walked 100 times while upset. "He thinks you're punishing him for the guest list." I sat with that for a moment, letting it land the way it deserved to land, which is to say, it landed hard and strange and almost darkly funny. 20 years of silence about my career. 20 years of never asking a single follow-up question when I mentioned a deployment, never once wondering aloud what special assignment might mean when I used that phrase at Christmas dinner, because it was the only phrase I was allowed to use, and the moment the truth surfaced without my permission in a magazine I hadn't even known was covering that event. His first instinct wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even guilt. It was suspicion. As if a woman who'd spent 2 decades not mentioning her own accomplishments had suddenly strategically decided to weaponize them the same week her sister got engaged. "I found out about that ceremony being published the same way you did," I told her, keeping my voice level even though something underneath my ribs had started to ache in a low, unfamiliar way. 30 seconds ago, from you." Lauren went quiet for a second. "I believe you," she said, finally softer. "I do. But Dad doesn't, and he's Savannah, he's spiraling. He keeps saying things like, 'Why wouldn't she tell us, and what else is she hiding?' And I don't know what to say to him because I don't know what you do either. Nobody in this family knows what you do." That last sentence sat between us like something neither of us wanted to touch. "Nobody's ever asked," I said quietly. "She didn't have a response to that. I didn't push her for one." We stayed on the line a moment longer, both of us breathing into the silence, both of us aware that something had shifted, that couldn't be unshifted, that a photograph and a caption had cracked open a door my family had spent 2 decades pretending didn't exist. Before we hung up, Lauren said one more thing, and it stayed with me long after the call ended, long after I'd turned off my office lights and walked out into the cool Washington night. "Dad thinks you planned this." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark, replaying every version of my life my father had never bothered to learn, wondering how a man could spend 20 years assuming the worst about a daughter he'd never once tried to understand. The truth about my family didn't start with a magazine photograph. It started decades earlier in a 2-story house in Roanoke, Virginia, where I learned early that love in our home came with conditions I never fully understood but always felt. My father, Wallace Griffin, ran a small insurance agency for 35 years. He was not a cruel man, not in any way you could point to and call abuse. He never raised his voice much, never raised his hand at all. His was a quieter kind of neglect, the kind that doesn't leave marks. You can show anyone just a slow accumulation of absences that taught you year by year where you ranked. When I graduated from West Point, my parents didn't come. My father said the drive was too long, that the timing conflicted with one of Lauren's cheerleading competitions, and that surely I understood since the Army would still be there next year, and Lauren's moment wouldn't. I stood on that field in New York in my dress grays, watching other cadets fold into the arms of parents who'd flown across the country, and I told myself it didn't matter. I was good at telling myself that. I'd had practice. When I was commissioned, when I made captain, when I pinned on my first set of silver oak leaves as a lieutenant colonel in a small ceremony at Fort Bragg, none of it registered back home the way Lauren's homecoming court nomination did, or her first big real estate closing, or the used car my father helped her buy at 19 with money I later learned had been quietly pulled from savings meant for both of us. I never said anything. What was there to say? My father had a phrase he liked to use whenever the subject of my service came up, usually delivered with a kind of weary patience, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow to catch on. "Military doesn't build families, Savannah. It breaks them apart." He said it about deployments. He said it about my decision back in my 20s to re-enlist instead of coming home to settle down the way he thought a daughter should. He said it more than once, as though my uniform were something I'd chosen instead of him, rather than something I'd chosen because it was the first place in my life that ever measured me by what I actually did instead of what I failed to be. What he never knew, because he never asked not once in 22 years, was what that uniform actually meant. He didn't know about the 18 months I spent in Iraq coordinating logistics for a forward operating base, under near constant threat about the convoy I redirected at the last possible minute. Based on intelligence, nobody else believed a decision that likely saved 11 lives and earned me a commendation I never mentioned at a single family dinner. He didn't know about Afghanistan, about the field hospital I helped establish in a province most Americans couldn't find on a map, about the nights I spent awake, making decisions that would follow me for the rest of my life. He didn't know about the Bronze Star sitting in a drawer in my apartment wrapped in the same tissue paper it came in, because I'd never found an occasion where showing it to him felt like it would matter. He didn't know because he never asked. And I never offered because somewhere along the way I'd absorbed the lesson so completely that I stopped expecting different. You learn not to bring gifts to a house where no one opens the door. The National Security Council posting came 3 years ago quietly through channels I'm still not permitted to fully describe. It required a level of clearance and vetting that took the better part of a year, background checks reaching back to elementary school teachers, interviews with people I hadn't spoken to since college. When it was finalized, I called my parents to tell them I was relocating to Washington for a new assignment. My father asked if it came with a raise. I told him it did, modestly. He said that was good, sounded satisfied, and then asked to speak to my mother about something concerning Lauren's upcoming open house. That was the entire conversation. 3 years of the most significant work of my life, and it had lasted less than 4 minutes on the phone, most of which concerned my sister's real estate listing. I'm not telling you this to make my father sound like a monster, because he wasn't one. He loved his daughters in the limited way he understood love as something you demonstrated through visible, legible success, the kind you could describe at church or brag about to neighbors over a fence. Lauren's success was easy to describe. Mine required security clearances he didn't have and explanations I wasn't allowed to give. I think in his mind, my silence read as failure, rather than what it actually was: discretion, duty, the quiet architecture of a life built to serve something larger than a family dinner conversation. I was still turning all of this over in my mind the next morning, sitting at my desk reviewing briefing materials I could barely focus on, when my phone lit up with call after call from a number I didn't recognize. Then one I did. My father's cell. I let each one go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready, and some cold, tired part of me had decided that not answering was its own kind of answer. Around 11 that morning, there was a soft knock at my office door. One of the West Wing staff members, a young woman named Priya who handled scheduling for our section, stepped in with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between amused and alarmed. "Colonel Griffin," she said carefully, "your father is here. I want to describe as precisely as I can what it looks like when a man who has spent 20 years underestimating you is forced to walk through the world you actually built." My father arrived at the Northwest Gate around 11:15 that morning, and from what I later pieced together from Priya, from the guards, from my father himself in the weeks that followed, he had no real plan beyond simply asking for me by name. He wore his good church jacket, the navy one with the slightly outdated lapels, and he'd combed his hair the way he does for occasions he considers important. I imagine he thought this would be like showing up at any office building, that he'd give my name to a receptionist and a few minutes later I'd walk out and we'd have some tense but ultimately manageable conversation in a lobby somewhere. That is not how the White House works, and my father learned this the hard way, standing at a checkpoint for the better part of 40 minutes, while Secret Service personnel verified his identity, cross-referenced his information, made calls to confirm that yes, a Colonel Savannah Griffin did in fact work in this building, and yes, this man claiming to be her father was, according to records, exactly that. I picture him standing there, increasingly aware that he had wandered into something far larger and far more serious than he'd understood from a magazine caption, his confidence eroding by the minute, in a way that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with simple, dawning comprehension. Priya came to get me once his clearance was processed, and I walked out to the visitor area with my stomach in knots, uncertain what version of my father I was about to meet, the accusatory one from Lauren's phone call, or someone else entirely. What I found was a man standing very still near the window, hands clasped in front of him, like he wasn't sure what to do with them, watching the flow of people moving purposefully around him. And what he was watching, I realized as I approached, was every single person who passed, nodding, greeting, acknowledging me before they even registered I had a visitor. "Good morning, Colonel," said a passing lieutenant colonel from Joint Staff, barely breaking stride. "Colonel Griffin." A nod from one of the NSC's senior directors, a 2-star general I'd worked alongside for 8 months on a matter I still can't discuss. My father's head turned each time, tracking the greetings the way you'd track something you were trying to add up in real time and couldn't quite make the numbers work. I saw the exact moment something in his face shifted. Not dramatic, not a gasp, just a slow recalibration behind his eyes, the look of a man realizing the ground he was standing on was not the ground he'd expected. "Dad," I said, stopping a few feet away. He turned to face me fully, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my father looked uncertain. Not stern, not disappointed. Uncertain in a way I'd never once seen from him, not at any graduation he'd skipped or any accomplishment he'd waved off. His eyes moved from my face to the insignia on my uniform to the hallway behind me, still processing the general who'd just walked past, still processing the deference in every voice that had spoken my name in the last 90 seconds. "I didn't know," he said finally. His voice had lost its usual certainty, that flat closing argument tone he used whenever he delivered one of his verdicts about my life. "Savannah, I had no idea any of this was real." I felt something rise in my throat, some old cornered version of myself that wanted to soften this for him, to reassure him the way I'd been reassuring him my whole life, filling every silence he left behind, so he'd never have to feel the weight of it. I made myself hold still instead. I made myself say the truest thing I had. "You never asked." It wasn't cruel the way I said it. I want to be clear about that. There was no triumph in my voice, no satisfaction at watching him absorb it. It was simply a fact laid down between us, The way facts sometimes need to be laid down before anything honest can happen. 22 years of silence hadn't been my choice alone. It had been built brick by brick out of every question he never bothered to ask, every ceremony he decided wasn't worth the drive, every conversation that ended the moment Lauren's name came up instead. My father didn't argue. That more than anything told me how deeply this had rattled him, because arguing was the one thing he always did, the reflex of a man who needed the last word in every conversation for as long as I'd known him. Instead, he stood there in the hallway of the West Wing, surrounded by the quiet machinery of a government he'd never once imagined his daughter belonged to, and he let my sentence sit in the air without defending himself against it. "Come to the party," he said instead, and his voice cracked slightly on the word party, like it had transformed in his mouth into something far more fragile than it had been 24 hours earlier. "Please, Savannah, come to Lauren's engagement party." I looked at him for a long moment, really looked the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, searching his face for whatever this was, whether it was genuine reckoning or simple panic about what his country club friends might now think of him. I still wasn't sure which, but something in his eyes, some unfamiliar rawness, made me hesitate before answering, made me realize this conversation wasn't finished, not by a long way. "I'll think about it," I said, and walked him back toward the gate myself, the two of us silent the whole way, 22 years of unspoken things trailing behind us like something finally beginning to unravel. I told myself I wasn't going. I told myself that for 2 full days, right up until Lauren called me again on Thursday night, and this time there was no performance in her voice, no rehearsed appeal on our father's behalf. She sounded scared. "The Ashworths know," she said. "About you, about everything." It turned out the same magazine that had upended my father's evening had made its way inevitably into the hands of Bradford's family, the kind of people who read political weeklies over breakfast the way other families read the sports section. Someone at their country club had mentioned it. A colonel in the family, they'd said, practically impressed, and Bradford's mother had asked Lauren about it, directly expecting some charming story about a distinguished older sister. Instead, she'd gotten a stammering, half-formed answer because Lauren herself barely knew what to say. She didn't know the details of my work. She didn't know how to explain a sister she'd spent years describing. When anyone asked, as someone who does something for the government, I'm not really sure what. The Ashworths, it turned out, did not take kindly to feeling misled. Bradford's mother, a woman named Constance, who I'd never met but who Lauren described in a tone somewhere between fear and awe, had apparently said something to the effect of families who hide things from us at the start tend to keep hiding things later. There had been a tense phone call between our father and Bradford's father. There had been talk briefly of postponing the engagement announcement altogether while the Ashworths reassessed. My father was, in Lauren's words, coming apart at the seams, terrified that his own decades of quiet dismissal toward me was about to cost his younger daughter the marriage he'd been quietly measuring his own success against for months. I sat with the phone against my ear, absorbing all of this, and felt something complicated move through me, not quite satisfaction, because I never wanted this for Lauren, never wanted my exclusion to become her burden. But underneath that, something closer to clarity. For 22 years, my life had been treated as something faintly embarrassing, something to downplay at gatherings, something my father actively hid from people whose opinions he valued. And now that same silence, that same shame he'd built around me had come due, and it wasn't going to be paid by him. It was about to be paid by my sister, at her own engagement party in front of the family she was marrying into. "I need you there," Lauren said, and her voice broke on the words in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "Not for Dad, for me. Please, Savannah." I thought about the 2-line text message that started all of this. I thought about the years before it, the graduations, the birthdays, the phone calls that lasted 4 minutes. And then I thought about my sister, 29 years old, standing in a room full of people who suddenly doubted her family's honesty, doubted her because of a truth nobody in our house had ever bothered to make room for. I said yes. I arrived at the Ashworth estate 2 days later on a warm Saturday evening, deliberately not in uniform. I wore the pale blue dress I'd originally bought for this exact event months earlier before any of this began, and I told myself I wasn't there to make a statement. I was there for Lauren, nothing more. That resolve lasted about 11 minutes. I was standing near the edge of the terrace, a glass of sparkling water in hand, trying to make myself as unremarkable as possible, when an older man in a tweed jacket approached with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd once worn a uniform himself. He introduced himself as a retired Marine colonel, a friend of the Ashworth family, and he'd apparently overheard someone mention my name near the bar. "Colonel Griffin," he said, extending his hand with a firmness that carried its own kind of respect. "I read about the operation you supported last year. Extraordinary work. It's an honor. I hadn't expected to be recognized, not there, not by anyone. But word moves quickly in certain circles, and within 20 minutes, 3 more people had approached a veteran who'd served in the same theater. I had a young naval officer who'd heard my name from his commanding officer, a woman whose husband had worked adjacent to my unit years earlier. None of them made a show of it. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet current of recognition moving through the party. Person by person, the kind of respect that doesn't need to be loud to be real. I found my father standing near the edge of the terrace at one point, holding a drink he hadn't touched, watching all of this unfold with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not pride, not yet. Something rawer than that. Something closer to grief, I think now, looking back. Grief for 22 years, he'd spent assuming a version of me that had never actually existed. Grief for every ceremony he'd skipped, believing there was nothing worth attending. He caught my eye across the terrace, and for a moment neither of us moved. The party continued around us, laughter and clinking glasses, and Lauren's bright, relieved smile as Constance Ashworth warmed visibly toward her. But between my father and me, there was only that long look, heavy with everything neither of us had said, yet everything still waiting to be spoken. He didn't come over. Not then. I think he understood in that moment that whatever needed to happen between us wasn't going to happen in front of an audience. My father found me 2 hours later, after most of the guests had migrated toward the dessert table, and the string quartet had shifted into something slower, quieter. He found me sitting alone on a stone bench at the edge of the garden, away from the noise, the way I'd been finding quiet corners at family gatherings my whole life. He sat down beside me without asking, which was unlike him, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "I told people you worked in an office," he finally said, staring straight ahead at the garden rather than at me. "For years. When your Aunt Carol asked what you did, I told her you did paperwork for the government. Filing, I think I said once. I made you sound—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I made you sound small." I didn't respond right away. I let him sit in it because I understood somewhere in the tired, careful part of myself that had absorbed slights for 2 decades that this wasn't a moment to rescue him from. He needed to say it out loud fully without me softening the landing the way I always had. "Why?" I asked finally, and I meant it as a real question, not an accusation. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the polish it usually carried, the confident closing statement cadence I'd grown up under. "Because I didn't understand it," he said. "The military. What it meant for a woman to go into it, to make a career out of it. My own father used to say things about servicewomen that I'm ashamed of now, and I think some part of that stuck with me longer than I ever admitted even to myself. I thought you'd come back changed in ways I couldn't handle. I thought you'd never have a family of your own, never have the kind of life I understood as successful. And when you didn't come back, when you kept going further and further into something I couldn't picture, I think I decided it was easier to assume you'd failed at something than to imagine you were succeeding at something I didn't understand." It was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me, and it landed with a strange, quiet weight, not vindication exactly, but something adjacent to it, the relief of finally hearing the shape of a wound named correctly, after years of only feeling its outline. Lauren joined us, not long after, drawn by some instinct that told her this conversation mattered, and she sat on the grass in front of the bench in her cream engagement dress, careless of the fabric, looking up at both of us like she was seeing her family clearly for the first time in years. "I didn't know either," she said quietly. "Any of it. I used to think you just didn't care about being close to us, that you chose your career over coming home, over being part of things." She shook her head slowly. "I never once thought you might have been protecting us, or protecting yourself. I never thought about what it cost you to stay quiet. I told them then for the first time about the Christmases. Every December for the past 11 years since I'd had enough rank and income to do it comfortably, I'd sent an anonymous package to my parents' house, good coffee, a nice blanket, 1 year tickets to a show, another year always arriving a week before Christmas. With no return address, no note, nothing to trace it back to me. I did it because I didn't want them to feel obligated to thank me, didn't want to create one more moment where my father would have to acknowledge me directly and inevitably fall short of whatever acknowledgement I was quietly hoping for. It was easier, I told them, to give without being seen giving. Safer. My father's face changed when I said this, a kind of collapse controlled but unmistakable, the look of a man realizing that the daughter he'd spent years dismissing had been quietly taking care of him from a distance the entire time, expecting nothing in return, not even credit. Lauren was crying by then, not the performative tears of a stressful engagement party, but something deeper, something that had clearly been building for hours, maybe years. "I always thought you were the strong one," she said. "The one who didn't need anything from us. I never thought about what that cost you to become." My father reached over and took my hand, the first time he'd touched me with any real tenderness since I was a child, and he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "There's something at the house. I want to show you. Both of you." He looked between Lauren and me, something resolved settling into his features like a decision he'd finally made after years of avoiding it. "I should have shown you a long time ago." I didn't know what he meant. I only knew that the man beside me on that bench looked different than the one who'd sent that text message 6 days earlier, smaller in some ways, more honest in others, like something rigid in him had finally been allowed to crack open. We drove to my parents' house the following afternoon, Lauren and I in my rental car, my father following behind in his own, and the whole way there I kept turning his words over in my mind, wondering what could possibly be waiting that he'd never shown us before. My mother met us at the door with an expression that told me she already knew what this was about, though she said nothing, just stepped aside, and led us in her eyes, moving to my father with something like quiet permission. He led us to the hall closet in the back bedroom, the one that had always been off limits when we were children, filled with what I'd assumed for decades was nothing more than old tax documents and Christmas decorations. He knelt down, pulled out a plastic storage bin, and set it on the bed between us. Inside, organized with more care than I would have expected from him, were dozens of envelopes bound loosely by year, going back further than I could immediately place. "What is this?" Lauren asked, reaching for one. "Read the front," my father said, and his voice had gone rough. I looked, and my own handwriting stared back at me. "Dear Dad, dear Mom and Dad, dear family." Letters I had written over the years from Fort Benning during my earliest training, from Iraq during my first deployment from Afghanistan 2 years later, from every posting and promotion and quiet milestone in between. I had sent them faithfully, the way you send something into a silence, hoping it might eventually be answered, never expecting acknowledgement, telling myself each time that it didn't matter whether anyone wrote back. I had stopped counting how many I'd sent somewhere around year 12. "You never opened them," I said. It wasn't a question. I could see it in the envelopes themselves, most still sealed, some yellowed slightly with age, a few with the flap barely lifted, and then pressed back down as though he'd started and lost his nerve. My father sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the storage bin between his hands. "I opened the first few," he admitted, "early on, and I didn't know what to do with what I read. You sounded so sure of yourself, so capable, describing things I couldn't picture, places I'd never been, decisions I couldn't have made in your position. It scared me, if I'm honest. It made me feel like I didn't know my own daughter anymore, like you'd become someone I had no claim to understanding. So I stopped opening them. I told myself I'd get to them eventually when I was ready, and then eventually became years and years, became decades, and I didn't know how to explain to you why I'd let it go on so long, so I just didn't." I sat down slowly on the small chair near the window, the bin of unopened letters between all three of us, like something finally excavated. Lauren was crying again, quietly this time, holding one of the envelopes against her chest. "May I read one?" I asked. Now, out loud. My father nodded, unable to speak. Unable. I chose one from early in my career, from my first year at Fort Benning, the paper soft with age. My voice caught slightly as I read my own younger handwriting, my own younger uncertainty laid bare in a way I'd forgotten I'd ever allowed myself to be. Dear Dad, I read. I know you don't understand why I chose this. I know it isn't what you pictured for me, and I know it probably isn't what you would have chosen if it had been up to you. But I need you to know that I'm not running from anything. I'm running toward something, toward a version of myself I think I can actually be proud of, even if it takes me a long time to get there, even if it takes you longer to understand it. I don't need you to be proud of me right now. I just hope that someday you'll want to know what my life actually looks like. That's all I'm asking for, not applause, just curiosity. Love, Savannah. The room was silent when I finished. My father had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way I had genuinely never witnessed from him in 46 years, not at funerals, not at anything. My mother stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. Lauren had moved to sit beside me, her head resting against my shoulder the way she used to when we were girls, and the house felt too big and too quiet for two sisters trying to find their footing in it. I'm sorry, my father finally said, lifting his head, his eyes red. I'm so sorry, Savannah, for all of it. The text message, the years before it, all of it. I don't know how to undo 2 decades of getting this wrong, but I want to try. If you'll let me. I didn't have a tidy answer for him in that moment. I didn't tell him it was fine because it wasn't, and I was done pretending otherwise for his comfort. But I didn't walk away either. I sat there in that room full of unopened letters and let something long buried finally begin to surface between us, not resolved, not yet, but no longer hidden. I stayed at my parents' house longer than I'd planned that evening, longer than I had in years, actually, past dinner, past the point where my mother finally turned on the lamps against the fading light outside. My father didn't try to fill every silence the way he used to, didn't rush to explain himself further or extract forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. He just sat with us, present in a way I don't think I'd ever fully experienced from him, and something about that stillness meant more than any apology could have. Before I left, he asked me to help him with one more thing. He'd found tucked at the bottom of that same storage bin a framed photograph from years earlier, me at 23, freshly commissioned, standing stiff and proud in my dress uniform outside the barracks at Fort Benning. I didn't even remember sending it. He must have kept it all this time, unopened envelopes worth of pride he'd never let himself display. He carried it into the living room himself, found a hammer and a nail, and hung it on the wall directly beside the large formal portrait of Lauren from her sorority formal, the one that had occupied that spot alone for as long as I could remember. He stepped back, looked at both photographs side by side, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to me. There, he said, his voice unsteady. That's 20 years late, but there. I won't pretend that single gesture repaired everything, because grief and neglect don't dissolve on command, no matter how sincere the apology. There will be more conversations ahead, harder ones, probably moments where old patterns try to resurface, and we'll both have to choose again and again to do better than we did before. But standing in that living room looking at 2 photographs finally hung as equals, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for over 2 decades. I drove back to Washington the next morning with the early sun coming up over the Virginia hills, and somewhere along that quiet stretch of highway, I found myself thinking not about the anger I'd carried for so long, but about what I actually needed all along. I used to believe it was an apology. I thought if my father ever said the words "I'm sorry," something in me would finally settle, finally feel complete. But sitting in that room the day before, listening to him weep over letters he'd been too afraid to open for 20 years, I understood it had never really been about the words at all. What I needed was simpler than an apology and somehow harder to ask for. I needed him to finally look at me, not the idea of me he'd built out of fear and discomfort and old prejudices he'd never examined, but the actual woman I'd become standing in front of him, worthy of being known. That's what arrived finally in that room full of unopened letters. Not a perfect resolution. Not a clean cinematic ending where everything painful simply disappears. Just a father finally willing to see his daughter clearly 22 years too late, and choosing in that lateness to try anyway. I think about that a lot now, weeks later, back at my desk in the White House, back in the quiet, demanding rhythm of the work I've built my life around. I think about how much of my strength over the years came from learning to stand on my own, to find worth in myself when no one else offered to help me find it. I don't regret that strength. It carried me through deployments and losses and decisions no one should have to make alone. But I've also learned something else in the weeks since that evening in my parents' living room, that needing people wanting to be seen by them isn't a weakness you outgrow. It's something you're allowed to keep wanting no matter how old you get, no matter how many medals or titles or private victories you accumulate along the way. Lauren and Bradford's wedding is in the spring. My father asked carefully, almost shyly, if I'd wear my dress uniform. Not to make a statement, he said, just because he wanted to see it, wanted to finally understand what it looked like on the daughter who'd worn it for over 20 years without an audience. I told him yes. If there's one thing I hope you carry away from this story, it's this: sometimes the people who hurt us aren't monsters, just people who never learned how to ask the right questions, who let fear and old habits stand in for genuine understanding. That doesn't excuse the years of silence, and it doesn't mean every ending looks like mine, but if there's someone in your life you've stopped expecting to truly see you, it might still be worth leaving the door open just a little the way I did without even meaning to. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have gone back to that party? Would you have opened that door again after everything? Tell me in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. We share stories like this every single day, real moments about family forgiveness and the quiet battles so many of us fight without anyone ever knowing. So if this one moved, you hit subscribe so you never miss the next story that might feel just a little too close to home. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.